In 2009, I was a graduate student at Appalachian State University, and I was hired by the Blue Ridge Parkway to research and write a historic resource study focusing on African Americans and the Parkway. Today, I would write this report very differently, and since 2009, I've learned a lot about white supremacy and systemic racism, and my part in it being a white person. I see now that my report fails to acknowledge the role white supremacy played in the creation of the Parkway and its effects on Black visitors. My report is incomplete without the voices and perspectives of African American people, and I'm so grateful to Park Ranger Ajena Rogers for being with us today to help us begin a more inclusive conversation. Here are a few quick facts about the Parkway. The Parkway is 469 miles long and runs on the top of Virginia and North Carolina's Blue Ridge Mountains. The Parkway is classified as a tourist road for passenger cars only and not for commercial use. It is a part of the U.S. government's national park system. Construction began in 1935 and was completed in sections over time until 1987. 15 million people visit the Parkway each year. I'd like to take a moment now to provide some context about white supremacy and systemic racism before we jump into the facts of the report. I'd like to start by acknowledging colonization is at the root of racism. National parks were created by violently displacing and breaking treaties with indigenous people. The Blue Ridge Parkway sits on unceded lands of the Cherokee, Monacan, and Catawba people. We acknowledge them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. It's always important to understand who holds the power, who's making the decisions, and who's writing the story. Here are a few main figures in Parkway planning in the mid-1930s. The Parkway was first suggested to President Roosevelt in 1933 with Virginia Senator Harry Byrd's idea to connect the Skyline Drive in Virginia to the Great Smoky Mountains in North Carolina. Harry Byrd was a segregationist and white separatist. Arno Kammerer, National Parks Service Director at the time, is pictured here. Josephus Daniels from North Carolina had the ear of President Roosevelt as the ambassador to Mexico, and Daniels advocated for the Parkway to take the route through Asheville instead of Tennessee. Daniels was also a white supremacist and segregationist, and was one of the leaders of the Wilmington Massacre in 1898. Harold Ickes was the Secretary of the Interior at the time and approved the Parkway in 1933. His views on race relations were a bit more progressive, as he was involved with the NAACP in Chicago. Stanley Abbott, a New York landscape architect, was hired to oversee the Parkway project. Robert Lee Doughton was a member of the House of Representatives from Laurel Springs, North Carolina, and he is said to be responsible for making a deal with President Roosevelt to ensure the Parkway would be routed through Asheville. Doughton was named after Confederate General Robert E. Lee, and his father was a Confederate captain. As we can see by these photos, that these men are white and privileged in their political influence. One of the few African Americans among these politicians was William J. Trent, Jr. He was the advisor on African American affairs to the Secretary of the Interior, who was Harold Ickes. Trent advocated for desegregating national parks facilities, and with the support of Ickes, the parks were desegregated in 1945. However, the Shenandoah National Park waited until 1950 to desegregate. When talking about African Americans and their use of the Parkway, we have to talk about the risks of driving while black. The myth of the open road was made for white people. White folks have the luxury of vacationing in faraway places for leisure without restrictions, traveling freely and safely with access to the resources they need when driving across the country. The Parkway was designed with white tourists in mind who live off the mountain, who have a car, paid time off, and extra income to spend on accommodations, food, and gas. Mobility is essential to freedom, writes Gretchen Soren, author of Driving While Black. And mobility has never been a right for everyone in the United States. So much of American law is focused upon policing black people and their movement in this country for the last 400 years, starting with slave patrols. Fast forward to the Jim Crow era. In the South, black travelers in the United States had no reliably safe access to services and accommodations while they were on the road because of racist segregation laws and white supremacist vigilantes. Data shows between 1916 and 1970, 6 million Southern black folks moved from the South to the North and West, seeking a safer place to live, fleeing segregation, terrorism, lynchings, and economic inequality. For many black families, long road trips were reserved for traveling back home to the South to reconnect with the family and friends who decided to stay. Traveling has always been a safety risk for African Americans in this country. Throughout the retelling of U.S. history, much of black history has been erased. The Parkway is no exception. All along, the Parkway has restored log cabins and story signs designated to present pioneer life, which was portrayed as white only, resulting in teaching visitors the myth of an all-white Appalachia, which has never been true and is not true today. This is an extension of white supremacy, and that erases black history. The three main subjects I focused on in my research in 2009 are segregation on the Parkway, the CCC camp in Galax, Virginia, and African American communities that surrounded the Parkway. The Parkway was open to visitors starting in 1937 during the Jim Crow era in the South. The Parkway targeted plans for segregated areas to correspond with large African American populations, which were around Lynchburg and Roanoke, Virginia. According to the 1940 census, Lynchburg and Roanoke reported 22,000 African Americans living in the two urban centers. It was reported in 1942 that less than 1/2 of 1% of Parkway visitors were African American. This statistic could be interpreted in many ways. Black folks may not have felt safe driving to or driving on the Parkway. Black folks may not have had the opportunity to have a job that allowed vacation days or to afford a car. This statistic would also influence the white Parkway planners to discard plans for segregated areas because they thought there was not a significant need to make those spaces available for black visitors. Cumberland Knob was the first recreation area to open in 1937. This recreation area is located on the border of North Carolina and Virginia. By 1940, a North Carolina Recreation Survey listed 5 campsites designated for African American use. There were no signs posted to designate the segregated area. A park ranger on duty was to direct black visitors to the area. And here's a master plan of the Cumberland Knob segregated area in 1943. You can see in the red box the segregated area. And you can see here on the map, the segregated area was well out of sight from the white campground, which makes it clear that the architects were trying to hide African American visitors. While there were several segregated areas proposed, there were only 2 implemented, and both were in North Carolina, in Cumberland Knob and Doughton Park. The second segregated area on the Parkway, Doughton Park in North Carolina, named after House Representative Robert Lee Doughton, This site was implemented in the early 1940s, and as you can see, the woods picnic area for African Americans is more hidden by trees and below a parking lot, and the Meadows picnic area for white visitors is more open with a view of picturesque mountain ranges. Here's a photo from 1976 of a comfort station with bathrooms built in 1942. And here it is in 2009 during my research study, still standing. The area was abandoned in late 1960s. The greatest effort to accommodate African American use on the Parkway was with the recreation area called Pine Spur at milepost 144, 27 miles south of Roanoke, Virginia. This recreation area was planned for African American use only and was to have a coffee shop, campgrounds, cabins, playgrounds, and a softball field. Construction began in 1941. With the completion of the entrance road, a picnic loop road, a parking area, and swings and picnic tables. In 1942, World War II stopped construction of the entire parkway. This could have been a major constraint in finishing Pine Spur, combined with limited resources. By the end of the war, in 1945, national parks had been desegregated with the help of William Trent, and Pine Spur was never opened or completed. The parkway was built by private contractors who did not keep personnel records, so it's difficult to find out who specifically worked on the construction of the parkway. But we can see here from the Parkway photo archives that there certainly were African Americans involved in the labor of building the parkway. Here in 1942, a paver and a road crew in 1973. The earliest photographic evidence that I could find in the archives of a black ranger was in 1973 with Willie McDaniel and, of course, Ajena Rogers with us here today in 1985. Civilian Conservation Corps, part of President Roosevelt's New Deal, was incorporated in the parkway, where there were 4 camps located along the parkway for landscape purposes. The exact location of this particular camp in Galax is uncertain, as it has been listed as at Fisher's Peak, Piper's Gap, and mentioned in a locally published book written about the Baywood area. This camp was all African American and were enrolled 180 people ranging from ages 18 to 25. And we know the camp opened in December of 1940 and closed in spring of 1942. In 1944, it was documented that the buildings were demolished, so there may not be any evidence of this camp today. Another focus of my study was exploring African American communities on the parkway or close by. An important aid in this research was the Blue Ridge Folklife Study done in 1978 by Dr. Patrick Mullen, which focused on a 10-mile radius around the parkway at the North Carolina-Virginia state line. Mullen photographed these communities and recorded oral histories with several African American folks from Sparta, North Carolina, and Galax, Virginia. These interviews have been digitized and now available to listen to at the Library of Congress website. Here's a photo of Lizzie Price, and she was a homesteader who moved to the Pine Spur area in Virginia to start farming and raising her family with her husband well before the parkway was built. Lizzie Price was born enslaved in 1845 below the mountain in Virginia. And she sold property to the government in the late 1940s because the government required her land to build the parkway through her land. She died at 108, and here she is at 106. Another displaced African American family was the Saunders. And here's a few pictures of the Saunders farm and cabin, who were also homesteaders. George and Bertie Saunders settled near Peaks of Otter in 1905. They raised 9 children on their land, which included a homestead, meat house, chicken house, and corn house. They sold land to the government in 1942 for $2,000 because the government required them to. There's a historical structures report that was done in 2005 where I gathered this information and photographs. There's no public access to the Saunders farm and no interpretive sign on the parkway for visitors to learn about the African American homesteaders. Nearby, just down the road, is the Johnson family farm, a white-owned homestead from the 1850s that was restored by the National Park Service in 1974. Interpreters here are on site at present, and the Johnson farm is accessible and open to the public. This is an example of the erasure of Black history on the parkway. More evidence of African American life and history can be seen in the cemeteries along the road. One is in Meadows of Dan, Virginia, where a Black cemetery is near Meadows of Dan Baptist Church. When the Parkway bought the land, the grave markers were mown over and lost. The number of burials is estimated between 8 and 10 people. In 2018, the Park Service placed a monument at the grave sites in memorial to those buried there. Another cemetery is at Spur Gap, near where Lizzie Price lived. Burials at the cemetery here continued until the 1980s, and on the Parkway there is no public access or interpretation at this graveyard at this time. There's much more research to be done on this topic, and a few suggestions would be to find more information about the experiences of Black Parkway Rangers. Were there any Parkway locations listed in the tourist books that African Americans use to find safe places? The CCC camp is also another focus of further research. If we could find the list of enrollees and find their relatives to do oral histories, we could learn more about what happened there. The Saunders farm needs to be restored, acknowledged, and interpreted for visitors to learn about the African American homesteading experience on the Parkway and in Appalachia. New research by Ann Wisnett brought to my attention that there is a Confederate memorial on the Parkway near Waynesville, North Carolina, and the Park Service needs to reckon with this fact and acknowledge the harm it causes for Black visitors. If you're interested in exploring more about the Parkway research, my report is available online, my full report from 2009, and you can also check out Ann Wisnett's book, Super Scenic Motorway, and Harley Jolly's book, The Blue Ridge Parkway, and the Saunders Farm Structures Report. For more information about African American experience and history in Appalachia, check out the Black in Appalachia podcast. And more information about systemic racism, check out Driving While Black by Gretchen Soren. So you want to talk about race by Ijeoma Ulu. My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. This concludes my part of the program, and I'd like to just take a moment to let all that information land. Ajena, thank you so much for being here. I know you traveled a long way.
Yes.
And, we did this presentation a year ago, and so we have a little practice here. But I'd love to hear about where you grew up and your introduction to the Parkway as a young person.
Sure. So I grew up in Roanoke, and my grandmother, my dad's mom, had come to live with us from South, and she remembered what it was like to grow up in the rural areas of South Carolina before moving to Alexandria. And then the church that I went to was full of people who were natives of Roanoke, Virginia, African Americans who had lived in the area for decades, if not a century. So though I was, I had roots coming from all different areas, the people who were raising me knew the mountains. As I recall growing up in Roanoke, we were down in the valley, and every day I could see Mill Mountain from my backyard. And we would go to the mountains, go up on Mill Mountain, go up Roanoke Mountain after church. And because it was inexpensive, it didn't cost anything. And it's either that or go to Baskin Robbins. You know, feeding 4 kids at Baskin Robbins every Sunday, or go for a free walk on the Roanoke Mountain. You know which one my dad chose. And we would be there, but I can tell you that I don't recall seeing a park ranger there until I got the job to interview for the Blue Ridge Parkway. And it was, I had heard of a park ranger before, because one time when we were out walking, my father stayed back and he stayed in the car, and he told us when we got back from our hike that someone had knocked on the window with a, you know, like a policeman, to see how they were how he was doing. And that's what he told us. And he was just sleeping and resting, and so I knew there was something there, but I didn't know that it was the Parkway. In fact, when my high school biology teacher called me and said that there was a job that was opening up on the Parkway and did I want to go, I said, great, that sounds wonderful, because you know, between my freshman year of college and sophomore year, I said, great, where's the Parkway? And when I went for the interview in Benton, I found out that the stretch of road that I'd be working in as a fee collector and also doing roads would be in the very place that I've been going all that time. So when you were talking about the statistic of a super small percentage,
one half of 1%.
1/2 of 1%, even though the population in Roanoke was huge, the people who raised me were already there at that time. And I do wonder now, was it because just not being able to get off to go to those places, or was it a lack of comfort being there, or is it, in my case, we were there when the Rangers weren't? You know, that's a lot of roadway with very few people to patrol it, and you might not have, we didn't see them, so how could we have been counted? But we were there. So it's interesting to realize that your own experience is a part of history. You've been around long enough, but that's the cool part about having started on the Parkway and been a part of this as long as I have now.
How long did you work on the Parkway?
Okay, I worked on the Parkway for basically 6 seasons. I was a seasonal park ranger for the first part of it, and then one of my co-rangers was a student at Radford University, Mosey Reed, and she learned about the co-op program and convinced me that I should do that too. And so I got a physics degree at JMU, but also a minor in biology, which fed into my co-op program. So I spent 6 seasons. They are 5 summers and 1 winter season. So, it was really a great experience too, because not only did I get the chance to work for the Parkway, but my 2 brothers came behind me, and then my sister said no. Too many caissons going through Roanoke Valley District. I'm not doing it. But we became a sort of a generation of people going through the Parkway.
What kind of interpretive programs did you do on the Parkway?
Yeah, that's the best part. So when I started out, I was very, very shy and didn't want to get up in front and talk to people. So even today, right now, it's like, oh my gosh. But it was to get and to do the programs that we did. I was a fee collector mostly, but as my fellow rangers can attest, duties as assigned were piled on top of that. So I got to do roves of the Roanoke River area and roving to talk to visitors on the mountain. I also did campfire programs. And my very first one was as Dr. Helga Nerkon, biologist, and talking about the life cycle and the trees and things like that. But Mosey convinced me that I had more that was within me. She used to do a program called Mountain Woman because she herself had Scotch-Irish roots and knew the stereotypes of the hillbillies. Everyone knows Beverly Hillbillies, at least at that time. That was the main outlook of what people in the mountains were like, you know, dirty clothes, rotten teeth, playing the banjo, like that. And she created her program, Mountain Woman, to dispel some of that. And then she turned to me and said, you know what, you could do that. You could talk about the Black experience. You could be a granny woman. And I said, I can't be a granny woman. They're round and black and heavy. And she looked me dead in the eye and said, is your grandmother round and black and heavy? I had bought into the stereotypes myself. And I had to admit, no. So with her encouragement, I created the program Granny Foster Remembers, where I imagined being back as you know, I'm 20 years old trying to portray a 90-some-year-old woman. And took a lot of acting. And it worked though, because I would transform from, you know, walking in with an old stick singing a hymn to being a young girl playing in the mountains with her friends, both black and white. And then the discovery of that racism creeps in, where she and her white friend are 15 years old, and her friend Callie Lou tells Ida that they have to stop playing together because they're grown women now. And the feeling of that and how you go on to carry on your life. But I was able to channel what my grandmother's stories had told, the stories she had told, and the stories of the women who were raising me in the church, but also the Folk Life Project. I'm so pleased to see that it's so accessible now, because it was on cassette tapes in 1985 and a big vinyl record that I was listening to. But I wanted to incorporate those stories, and I did that program for more than, I guess, for about 6 years, and I traveled around with that program. But that was what got me doing living history for like 20 years of my career, and really realizing that even though I had felt I didn't fit in any place, that I had a place, that I was already in a place that I fit, and that I could use the experience of people around me to help others understand those places, and that we were and are here. And that's the power of interpretation and the power of the Parkway. And also the power, it tells me that if people are willing to hear each other's stories and encourage each other, we can stop talking past and find that common ground, and tell those stories. So I'm always grateful for the Parkway.
Are there other things that you'd like to say in reflection to the facts that I've just presented?
Well, when I used to do my Granny Foster program, there's a poem that I'd like to share, because it comes out of a report, I think it was from Appalachian State, I'm not sure, can't remember. It was a magazine called Now and Then, and they featured it about African American and blacks on the Blue Ridge Parkway, or blacks in Appalachia. And what really struck home for me was a woman's poem. The woman was named Rita Bradley, and I used to have it memorized, but I'm going to use a crutch today because my hair's going to grow old. All right, I was going to try that, but no. I just need, I want to share this because I want to get it right as she did. It says, you call me black when my skin is tan, my daughter is golden, and my son's hair is bronze. I'm supposed to be soul, yet I love country music, boots, blue jeans, and hoedowns. I'm proud of my African ancestry, but I am sick inside of being denied my Scotch-Irish heritage. I'm one part Cherokee Indian, happy about it, and look it. I feel secure in the mountains. There's nothing like the beauty of the nearby mountain ranges tipped with clouds. I love mountain crafts, mountain people, and babbling mountain streams. Oh, for my spirit to be allowed to soar free. How I long for acknowledgement as a true and intricate part of the mountain scene. I am here. I belong here. I am Appalachia's, and Appalachia is mine.
Amen.
We would like to open the floor for questions if folks had any.
I had one question, and you spoke of the acquisition of land. How often was the law of eminent domain used, and did you find evidence that there was much abuse in terms of particularly the acquisition of land from African Americans?
That's a great question. I didn't do a lot of research on eminent domain and acquisition. These are the facts in the presentation were just some records that I came across when I was looking through the archives. But the Parkway did indeed use eminent domain a lot and displaced many people. And other scholars have researched that extensively.
And there's some more studies that are currently being done. So yours was in 2009, and Wisnett did hers. And then the Park Service has a new study that's coming out through the Office of Historians very soon about segregation within the parks in Virginia. And so the work is ongoing. But to the question of how often was it used, I think that is where we need to, that's another place where we can expand to really just see exactly how it was there. Because I know just from in the past, Shenandoah National Park has done a lot of research about displacement of both the people, all kinds who were there, and the resentment that folks had because they were forcibly moved from those communities, and to get the stories of both black and white who were displaced because they weren't, this was supposed to be a natural area. That myth of it was all beautiful mountains and streams and no people. Well, what about those cabins, those fireplaces that are sitting off in the woods? We have learned now as an agency to be more mindful of telling cultural and natural together. But it's beginning.
Thank you.
The park is so big, how do you document how many people use it and information about who these people are?
That's a great question. I don't know how they measured that. So that's another point of research to understand. How did they measure how many people came through and who was white and who was black, and how do they count them?
Yeah, because when I was in 1980s, we had traffic counters. You know, the cars running over it, and then you had a formula and a calculator, calculation for how many people were going over. Of course, that's not going to take a picture of, who's white, who's black, doing that. But I remember in your talk how that was used against having facilities for black people. Because, if you don't make it welcoming, I'm sorry, excuse me, I'm doing a clap back. If you don't make it welcoming, of course, you're not going to come. You're going to stay where you feel welcome and comfortable.
I guess I'm one of those hillbillies that you talked about, being a native of Blowing Rock. I can remember vividly the park rangers that I knew as a child. It seemed like there were a lot of them. They integrated into the town and became friends with all of the locals. And now not so much and probably they're few and far between now than there were back as I was a child. But my father in 1957 and 58 built an inn in Blowing Rock, the Azalea Garden. And as we had a very small staff. There was my brother and me and two ladies who cleaned our rooms. But one day he took us all and we were having a meeting, and it was because of segregation becoming more in the news. And he said to us, now we may see African American people coming to make a reservation at our inn. And I would like you all to be welcoming to them. And unfortunately, from the years of 1958 till he sold it in 1970, my brother and I were so disappointed. We never, ever had anyone African American try to rent a room with us. It was kind of sad. We were just really disappointed. I do not remember seeing people coming into Blowing Rock, because we were always uptown in the park and playing around. They were not enjoying this place as they should have been able to do.
Yeah. And I think some of it, I'm just learning about this area, but help me, Moses Cone folks. Didn't Bertha and Moses Cone bring their staff down here with them? And many of them were African American. And there were communities here that they were among. Where are the stories of those people? How do we integrate that into the everyday storytelling that we do? That is how you can bring the full picture and presence of the people who were here. And so I'm sure that I'm guessing that the black folk who came and were traveling would go to those places, not your inn, but they went to the places in the community that were the people that looked like them, because they knew that it was safe. So I'm just guessing.
I was just going to say, are you familiar with the publication that over the years from the 40s and maybe late 30s
The Green Book.
circulated among the African American communities that recommended places that you should visit, go to eat, and they were all owned by African Americans. And I was wondering as you spoke if there were any sites listed on the Blue Ridge Parkway.
That's another point of further research that I would like to see done. I definitely want to find those publications that were circulated in the area, but I'm not sure where to go to find those. But yes,
I'll try to find a source for it.
Yeah, good. See, this is exactly that's why we do this program, to get people with sharing those stories, like and like the book, the places where folks were going. And there's a new book that just came out last year called Traveling Black that might help with some of that too.
I was going to say about the erasure of African Americans on the Parkway. The decision was made at the Moses Cone Manor to tear down the quarters for the servants, the black servants that the Cone family brought with them from Maryland.
Gotcha.
And so that's gone.
Gotcha. Yeah,
but-
and that often happens, even with black cemeteries, for example. They're rolled over and erased and things. And
that is not exactly true. So one of the two black servants' quarters that was located behind the house has been relocated and is in the field out behind the carriage barn.
there you go.
So the white cottage you see out behind the carriage barn was one of the two black servants' quarters physically moved to a new location.
Okay, so the stories are coming back, and even if it's not the physical spaces, what's wrong with incorporating it into the storytelling?
Yes, you had mentioned the Confederate monument in Waynesville.
Yes.
And yes, it is hurtful, so I was just curious, are there discussions to have that taken down?
I just learned about this last year when Ann Winsmith did a similar presentation. So I'm not sure about the movements around or conversations around that particular place, if who is involved in that, but we should get involved, yeah. Sure.
I was a seasonal park ranger at the Moses Cone Estate between 92 and 99, and we ended up doing a lot of oral history interviews with their local tenants. We actually had an oral history blitz, and some of the stories that came out that were really heartening were about a lot of the help that came down from Baltimore, who all were African American, especially the chauffeur, Ed Bumpus. He was very well beloved by the whole entire community there. I mean, when he was driving Mrs. Cone's Lincoln, he would give people rides back.
Yeah.
And he was always, he and his wife Mary were just as very beloved in that community. I mean, they even went to the Sandy Flats Baptist Church, which was unusual in that time, but but they were there, and there was a lot of stories that I think we could have access to. And I know when I was a ranger there, I definitely told those stories when we did programs, Cone Mini Talks and the Cone Grave Walks. And even now, I'm working after a teaching career. I'm back at Doughton Park at their cabin, and I'm getting stories about the African Americans in the community and just the closest to the people around the area, especially the Union Baptists. But we are getting stories out, and we get them. I think we don't ignore them, and we want to know more.
Right. I mean, tell the whole thing as best you can. And I know as park rangers, we, the ones who are employed, are just spread out. You were saying you don't see us as much because there are fewer of us trying to cover more spaces than we ever have had before. We rely on volunteers, we rely on the community to, first of all, let us know that you want to hear these stories. I mean, look at this full room. Look at this room. Look at this room. And to get that reinforced, to let somebody like me know that you want to hear these stories, that they are important, not something to be set aside. It's important. But you have to have that invitation, you have to have that support and the willingness to say, hey, let's sit down. Let's have a conversation. Let's have scones together. Yes.
We were so excited to hear about the presentation today because of our wonderful experiences our family has had on the Parkway. We live in Morganton, she lives in Charlotte, but over the years, we've always come to the Parkway with family picnics And when you said after church, those are days in the 80s and the 90s that we have been able to have wonderful experiences.
Yeah, we did too. We did too.
One more?
I would like to vigorously thank our National Park Service. Today makes me think of, first of all, you may not retire.
Oh no, I'm only
You are-
57.
No,
I got
I know. Well, and
I got
that's my
50 years to put in.
You may not retire. We were on the West Coast a couple of years ago and had the great pleasure of hearing Miss Betty.
Oh yes, Betty Soskin.
Yes,
Yeah.
Betty Suskin. And we had such a good time. You need to put this program on again tomorrow. We went back the next day to hear her again. And the Parkway kept her employed until she was 100, is that right?
She just retired
Yes.
this past March.
But after
Yes.
turning 100.
After turning
You
100.
are too young to retire.
She was 96.
True story. When I
But-
started on the Parkway, I just turned 19, and I was so excited. I said, "Oh my gosh, I'm going to work for the Park Service for 50 years." And then I got it 10 years in. I said, "I'm going to work for them for 40." And then 20 years in, oh, it's going to be 30. But now that it's almost 40, I was like, "Oh, what's another 10 years?" So back up to my original 50.
The second half of the comment is that you bring to life, you and your colleague bring to life for us lily white folks and put before us the reality of the history that's not been. I grew up next to the Parkway. I was on it all the time. It was 12 years after Brown versus Board of Education, before my younger brother was in high school in Augusta County, Virginia, with a person of color. 12 years after. And you and Miss
Miss
Betty,
Jones. Yes, Betty.
Suskin, you may not retire. You may not.
I will take that into advisement.